On today's episode of the Nikhil Hogan Show, I am delighted to talk to top jazz drummer Austin McMahon. We talked to Austin about his development as a teenager, studying under both Tommy and Sonny Igoe, his approach to improvisation, listening to the essential jazz recordings, his favorite drummers, playing uptempo, future projects with his label Fractamodi, and much, much more. Stay tuned, you're listening to the Nikhil Hogan Show. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show. We are so delighted to have a wonderful guest today. We have Austin McMahon. He's a wonderful drummer. He's performed regularly with Jerry Braganza's Quartet, and he's recently performed and or recorded with Sean Jones, George Garzone, Joe Lovano, Lionel Loueke, Ben Monder, Lage Lund, Kate McGarry, Noah Preminger, The Fringe, Jason Palmer, and Grace Kelly. He has appeared as an opening act for Grammy Award winners Dianne Reeves and Esperanza Spalding. On tour, Austin has performed at prestigious venues such as Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, and many, many jazz festivals across the country and internationally. Austin is the winner of the 9th Annual Independent Music Awards for Jazz Song category and nominee for Best Jazz Album in the 11th Annual IMAs. His debut CD, Many Muses, was selected as a CDB editor's pick and described as subtle, reverential to tradition, and thoroughly new. He was recently featured on NPR Jazz Set with Dee Dee Bridgewater, WLRN Miami, and live on WGBH Radio Boston. He currently teaches at the Jazz Department in New England Conservatory Preparatory and Continuing Education Division, and was a teaching assistant for jazz improvisation at Harvard University for 6 consecutive years. He has given master classes at Harvard, University of Miami, University of Mainz, Germany, as well as numerous colleges and high schools throughout the United States. He's the co-founder and producer and recording artist for the burgeoning record label Fractamodi, and has recorded over 40 commercially released albums in the past several years. Austin, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
And also on the broadcast is, of course, our great friend, Christopher Jengalewski. Chris, how are you doing?
Well, how are you?
Wonderful. Hi, guys. Nice to have you guys on the show. Austin, it's such a delight to have you. Chris speaks so highly of you, and it made me really excited to have you on the broadcast because Chris is very discerning with his players, and if you pass that test, and I listened to you, and you're truly, truly a great player.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Well, I want to pick your brain when it comes to drumming and playing straight-ahead jazz, but before we do that, maybe can I just really get your past background? I really want to know how you got started in drums and who were your early influences.
Sure. Well, I got started in drums actually because my sister was playing the drums in the high school band, basically. And my sister was about 3.5 years older than me. And, I looked up to her, and so she was playing various instruments and I was playing various instruments because music was an important part of our childhood. And at some point when she got to high school, I was still in middle school, she switched over to drums, and I was like, wow, I want to try that. And it was one of those things that basically just kind of right when I tried it, it kind of clicked. And I had been playing piano for a few years, and I'd been playing saxophone actually for a couple of years as well. But when I picked up the drumsticks, it kind of felt like, oh, I finally found exactly what I've been looking for in music. So after that, I had the great fortune of being in an area that had a very good music program. I grew up about 35 miles outside of New York City. So a lot of the band directors and music instructors in my area were these, really incredible professional musicians from the New York jazz scene, and not just jazz at that time, of course, but the music scene in general. And so my band director just said, "Oh, you're into drums. Let me get you a good teacher." And so he brought this teacher to meet with me, and it turned out that it was Tommy Igoe. And I don't know if you...
No, yeah, I know that. I know because Chris has a book by him, and he keeps mentioning that book full of exercises.
Sure, exactly. And so Tommy was my first drum teacher. And it was just complete happenstance. It was just, like I said, my geographic location close to New York, and Tommy was writing some drumline scores, like for our high school marching band. And my band director just said, "Hey, I have this young drummer who's interested in taking some lessons. Will you teach him?"
How young were you, by the way?
I guess I got into drumming, I guess, when I was about 13. So I started taking lessons with Tommy when I was 14.
Okay.
So it wasn't incredibly early. You know, like I said, I had done music prior to that. I had been taking piano lessons since I was about 8 or 9 years old. And then I played saxophone when I was 10 and 11, or even 11 and 12, in school band, just very basic stuff, not jazz improvising or anything yet. So I started drums when I was about 14. And so, so I had no idea who Tommy was or what I was getting myself into. But, you know, after the first couple of lessons, that also clicked really well. So Tommy and I he was giving me all these challenges, really pushing me right from the beginning. And I just was responding, and I was really into it. And then gradually I started to learn a little bit more about Tommy. But, you know, to be honest, he actually didn't really grow to the level of fame that he has now, both in drumming education and as a performer, until probably the last 5 years, I would say. So when I was studying with him, he was an achieved, accomplished musician at the time, but he wasn't like a household name in the jazz world or in the drumming world as much as he is now. So, I mean, he was doing the Lion King, and he was doing the Birdland Big Band already at that time. But
Whoa, okay.
So that Birdland Big Band thing has been going on for a long time, and he just took over as the leader. You know, like I said, about 5 years ago, I think, is when he kind of skyrocketed to notoriety. Right. And I mean, it's a notoriety that he's deserved all along. It was just, you know, he was a working musician in New York and touring with various people. But
can you describe his lessons? Like, how did he approach teaching you?
Yes, sure. It was very structured. It was very disciplined, and I actually now, as a teacher myself, I follow similar methods with my students, and I find it to be very effective. Partly maybe because it's just kind of ingrained in me. So basically, the lessons were structured in a way where we would start out with a warm up, and as Chris probably knows, and maybe you do too, the Lifetime Warmup is kind of one of his things. That's one of the staple kind of Tommy Igoe things.
Can you describe it for the audience?
Sure. Yeah, the Lifetime Warmup, basically it begins with a very common kind of warm up where you do 8 strokes on your right hand followed by 8 strokes on your left. Then you do 7 strokes on your right hand, 7 on your left, 6, etc. down, and then you count down. And basically, when you get to 2 strokes on each hand, you begin a long roll or a continuous double stroke roll. And so at that point, and you know, you can do various different things with the countdown. Tommy would sometimes have us stay on 8 for a long time and then go to 7. And but then once you get to the double stroke roll, the reason it's called the Lifetime Warm-Up is because you then go through pretty much every single rudiment that exists and all sorts of different kind of sticking patterns, one by one from the long roll. So basically you continue this long roll, and then he'll say 5 stroke roll, and there's a specific pattern. And this is built progressively. When I was studying with him, it was like week 1, we just do the countdown, and then we go to doubles. And then week 2, now let's add the singles and the doubles exercise after that. Then week 3, okay, you worked on the 5-stroke roll this week, so let's add the 5-stroke roll to the warm-up. So basically, over the course of essentially what could be considered 26 weeks, if we're talking about the original 26 rudiments, you build yourself up to the entire Lifetime warm-up. So it takes almost maybe not quite a year to get the full warm-up in when you're studying with him, or when I was studying with him.
Right.
And he was doing it week after week. But then once you have it, then you just kind of go through the whole warm-up and you get through it pretty quickly. So, I still use that warm-up or portions of it every day in my practice. And also with my students, I use, again, portions of it, or, mostly just portions of it with my students. I don't think I've had a student that I've gotten all the way through the entire lifetime.
The 4 T's, how did that integrate? The time, pace, touch, technique, is that from him as well, or is that an original thing you coined?
No, so that was also from Tommy, but that was actually more from his dad. So there was one summer I was studying with Tommy, as you know, as we've been discussing. And one summer I said, "So when can I have my next lesson?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm going out on the road with Art Garfunkel this whole summer. So go study with my dad." And I said, "Okay." And I didn't know who his dad was, and hopefully by this time, I was about 17 at this point, I think. So I had studied a little bit more about jazz, so I knew a little bit more about Tommy and his experience. And then I also did some research on his dad. And so anyway, I show up, that summer. I just show up at his dad's basement, and he's got this funny sign over the back door that says Sonny's Drum Camp or something like that. And it probably says something like, beware, enter, whoever,
no.
like something like that. Like he was a funny guy, but again, he was very disciplined and very structured. And it turns out Sonny was close friends with Buddy Rich, and anytime somebody would come up to Buddy Rich, the story goes that, yeah, it turns out, like, if you were at a Buddy Rich concert and you went up to Buddy afterwards and said, "Hey, I want drum lessons," he would say, "Oh, call my buddy Sonny. I don't teach." And that's how the story goes. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but I mean, I believe it because I know Sonny, and he was a great teacher. And that summer was very different than Tommy's lessons. But for example, the very first thing, I was playing match grip with Tommy, holding both sticks with the same grip. And I showed up at the first lesson, and we sat down and we were doing the Lifetime Warmup, which Sonny also did. So, Tommy, I think Tommy tries to give credit to Sonny because I think a lot of it comes from him as well. But he was like, "What's wrong with your left hand, Austin?" And I said, "What do you mean? What's wrong with my left hand?" And he just like, "Well," he said, "Why are you holding the stick like that?" And I said, I play match grip mostly." And he's like, "Okay, well, next time let's work a little bit on traditional grip." So I assumed that meant that next time I would show up at my lesson and we'd sit down and we'd talk a little bit about what the traditional grip was and how to implement it. And the next lesson we just sat down and he said, "All right, let's do the Lifetime." And I held my left hand traditional grip and we just did it, and that was it. It was like, so there was not a whole lot of discussion of how to do it. It was just like I was just assumed that was my homework that week, just figure out the traditional grip. But getting back to Chris's comment about the time, taste, touch, and technique, that actually, I first was exposed to that from Sonny, because that was kind of his 4Ts, and he liked to joke around that the fifth T was Tommy.
Oh.
in which I thought was endearing because he had so much love and respect for his son, of course, as a family member, but also for his drumming. Because one time I was over at Sonny's house for a lesson, and Tommy shows up, and I'm like, "Oh, how could I get so lucky that Tommy walks in when I'm having a lesson with his dad?" And so Sonny's like, "All right, let's put him on the spot." And so Sonny takes out a chart that he had just, he used to transcribe all these charts. He would just sit down and listen to a recording of a Buddy Rich recording or whatever, so many different things. And he would just write out a drum chart for it. And so he puts a drum chart down on a music stand, and he puts the record on, and he's like, "All right, Tommy, here you go." And just like counts it off and shows him the chart. And Tommy just destroys this chart. He's sight reading it, but it sounds like he's been playing it for years, with this band. And so then, Sonny looks over at me and he's like, "I don't get it." It seems like Sonny was even just dumbfounded by Tommy's ability to kind of just own a tune, or just be able to have that kind of command over the instrument. And
Wow.
So, but the 4Ts really came from Sonny, and I really took them to heart, though, because that's how you become a successful musician, is by playing good time and having good taste, in that you're not, time is kind of obvious, and not necessarily just metronomic time, but time that agrees with the rest of the band, starting with the bass player and all that jazz. And then taste, just, knowing when it's time to kind of be a little more heavily interactive, and knowing when it's time to kind of sit back and be in more of an accompanist role. And then touch, of course, that's a big one for me, because I was playing with, when I first got to school in Miami, I was doing a lot of kind of quiet background gigs, which is not how I had been practicing throughout high school. I had been really kind of letting it out and, using music as an outlet and drumming as an outlet for my emotions and et cetera, and also just kind of developing my technique. So I was probably hitting the drums a little harder and trying to play fast stuff and trying to play loud and all that. And when I got to college and started doing some gigs around town, it was kind of like, well, you got to play nice and light. So the touch thing kind of came in later, but that's something that I worked really hard to develop, especially because I got really into the setting of the piano trio, just piano, bass, and drums.
When you were taking lessons with Tommy, did he make you transcribe, like kind of how you just described did transcriptions? Did he tell you to go back and listen to this record and come back with a transcription?
Yes, and so there was a lot of that kind of like, it was in terms of, it wasn't like for me to transcribe the drum solo or a specific drum part necessarily. It was more often for me to transcribe or write out a chart that a drummer would read, that I could write a chart for this recording or for this particular song, and I could put it in front of him and he would successfully play the song similarly to how it was played on the recording, with where the hits are and whatnot. So it was mostly in a big band setting that we would do those sort of chart transcriptions. And that's sometimes kind of a lost art, because I don't think a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on drum charts, to be honest. And I think it's even great composers and arrangers today sometimes ask me, they'll say, is that a good way to write that? Literally things like that. So I don't think there's a really strong method that's consistent through the whole jazz community. I think there are some standards that people follow and that are known. It's just you get a drum chart from one band leader and it might look like one thing, and you get it from a different band leader and it looks completely different. So interpreting that was one of the goals he had for me, was to be able to interpret these different kinds of charts. And I remember even having discussions with Tommy. He said, you're not going to have charts that look like this all the time. Sometimes you'll have to kind of make up your own interpretations as you go, because the chart will be very sparse. It might not have this many hits or whatever, or this much information about what you're supposed to do.
Right. I wanted to ask you, big band versus small quartets and quintets, obviously a huge difference in the arrangement. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps those charts when you're thinking, when you're talking about charts, are you thinking more in terms of the larger ensembles like big bands versus the smaller quartets?
Yes, I am in general, because that was sort of one of the things that Tommy was specifically working on with me. And also, I mean, it applied to other things, like other situations where you'd be reading hits and figures, such as a Broadway show, or there are plenty of examples of smaller groups that are kind of structured in similar ways, like a sax ensemble, for example, where you might have 4 saxophones and bass and drums and piano, or something like that, 4 saxophones with a rhythm section, where the charts would be written out more similarly to a big band chart than a small group chart. Because a lot of times when it comes to a small group, you might just be looking at a lead sheet. You might be looking at literally the same chart that the piano player and the bass player and the melody instruments are looking at. Or you might not even have a chart in a small group. Sometimes they might just say it's an AABA tune or something like that, and they just might say medium swing, and then you just go from there. So yeah, a lot of when I talk about charts, I'm primarily talking about big band charts, and that's dealing with understanding when a hit or a figure is written within the staff, it has a different meaning than if it's written as a cue above the staff. You know what I mean? So those types of distinctions were what he was trying to really get me to understand. And I mean, it's been hugely beneficial to my reading and my playing in various settings, not just the big band setting, definitely.
When it comes to small, okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes. I'd really like to ask you, because those slashes, whenever a drummer just sees slashes for like a small quartet or anything, that often, it's like a blank page. People just panic. They just don't know what to do. they might just have a fixed pattern in their mind. I know a lot of new drummers when they go to college, They might just say, okay, I know this. And you can't do that. You can't just do the swing pattern because there's a whole massive vocabulary and literature when it comes to drumming. So where does one begin to start to build that vocabulary for when you see slashes? What do you do?
Yeah, well, I think the number one is listening. I think the only way that anyone can get experience or understand jazz fully is by listening to jazz and by listening to sort of the essential recordings. I mean, there's too many essential recordings to mention them all, but going back to understanding what the early bebop drummers were playing and how that applied to the song. And so I think, like I said, number one is listening. And I think that's one thing that's missing maybe nowadays with a lot of my students is they come in and they say, well, I want to learn how to play jazz. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you listening to? Do you listen to Miles Davis? Do you listen to John Coltrane? Blah, blah, blah. And they're like, no. And I say, okay, well, are you listening to anything modern? Maybe you're listening to Gerald Clayton, or maybe you're listening to this or that. And
look, I just want to play jazz. Don't tell me about that.
Exactly. And so I'm saying, well, without hearing it, there's no real foundation for understanding what it consists of. And of course, you can also argue that jazz can kind of be anything. Jazz stylistically is so broad, and it kind of borrows from so many different styles and kind of adapts it to itself. So obviously you can listen to pop music primarily and still kind of play jazz and use that, what you listen to in the setting. But still, I think it's important to be informed by what was happening in the 50s, the 1950s and 1960s mainly. And of course, before and after that is totally relevant and important.
Can we take a specific recording? Okay, let's take a specific recording. Let's say you had a new student and you said, "All right, I want you to listen to this record for let's say for like bebop." So, yeah. What would you make that student listen? Like what would you make that student do to consciously think of while listening to that record?
So, and I guess for me, what's tricky about this is when I'm starting with jazz, I don't necessarily dive straight into bebop. I guess usually where I start is actually with Kind of Blue, with Miles Davis Kind of Blue, with Jimmy Cobb on drums, because I find that Jimmy Cobb's playing kind of encompasses the concept, maybe the four T's in a way, that he was primarily playing steady time and being a really strong accompanist and very tasteful and had a great touch and, had control over the instrument. And so I guess I start with him and that recording because it's subtle. It's like it has all the elements that we need to understand about what it takes to be a successful jazz drummer, in my opinion. Other
which
people
album?
Could have various
would you say Kind of Blue? Is that which track in particular?
Yeah.
The whole album, probably.
Yeah, the whole album, but different tracks have different things, different elements.
Should we get into the weeds now? Let's get detailed. So let's take any track.
Yeah, I mean, I start by showing Freddie Freeloader to my students usually, and the reason for that is because Jimmy Cobb actually plays a groove. And one thing that I think people think is different about jazz is that you don't play a groove. And for some reason, I disagree with that. I think that you're playing a groove or you're playing a beat in jazz just as much as you're playing a beat in a rock tune, but it's just a different beat. And it has a different bounce to it, but it is consistent and it's repetitive to some degree. Of course, there is an expectation of some variation for rhythmic interest, but at its core, it has the same component as a rock beat, or as a funk beat, or whatever, Brazilian groove, or whatever you can name any style, and I think there's consistencies throughout. So I start with Freddie Freeloader because he's playing a groove. There's a rim knock on beat 4 where he's going ding 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 back ding 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 back ding, because I think that helps a young drummer understand that your job as a jazz drummer is still to play steady time and is still to play a steady beat, at least behind the melody. Then we talk about how when we get into the solos, you listen primarily for what's happening in the left hand, where we know that the ride cymbal is going to stay steady and consistent because that's our timekeeper, and hi-hat on 2 and 4. But the snare drum is going to be what's the first element that we kind of discuss as interacting with the soloist, which is then what takes jazz away from just being a groove, a jazz drummer being just a groove drummer, and more of an interactive element that adds interest, rhythmic interest, and sometimes even melodic interest to what the soloist is doing, and that's where the word comping comes into play, meaning both accompaniment and complementing the soloist. So we'll listen to the melody and how Jimmy Cobb plays a groove, and then we'll see how far he strays from that groove while he's accompanying the soloist. And usually students are kind of surprised. They think, oh, wow, I didn't realize it was so consistent. And again, once we get beyond records like Kind of Blue and get into a little bit more bebop, there's more variations on the ride cymbal. Different drummers like Roy Haynes, for example, started to kind of really modify what was happening and how everything balanced with the swing feel. And so that but starting with Jimmy Cobb and that recording kind of gives you a quick understanding of what it takes to be a jazz drummer, and then you build upon that. And sorry, go ahead. Did you have something to say?
Yeah. So that's wonderful. So, okay, let's say a student now has been with you for a while and he's got the basics. He can hold together a groove, and now you want to take that student to the next level, listening wise. What records would you recommend, and then what would you start to look out for?
Well, again, the list is so numerous that it's hard to kind of rein it in. But I think the next drummer that I usually show my students, I would say the next 3 or 4 drummers that I introduce my students to would be Max Roach. And again, this isn't just about the drummer. Of course, the recordings that they played on are sometimes as important or more important than the actual drummer or the drumming on those records. So I'm mentioning the drummers because I think, because that's my perspective. So that's the easiest way to kind of convey this. So Max Roach, Art Blakey, Roy Haynes, Billy Higgins, and there's probably one that I'm missing.
Let's do a really quick, like a quick 3-sentence description of each of those drummers you named. So let's start with maybe Roy Haynes. Give me the best you can do, a 3-sentence description.
Well, Roy Haynes, it turns out that there's actually a 3-word description for Roy Haynes that already exists that I didn't coin, but it kind of sums him up, and it's snap, crackle, pop. and I don't know who came up with that actually, but I find it pretty fitting because Roy Haynes had kind of a like a bright sound. It was every single stroke was very clear. You know what I mean? It's almost like pointillistic drumming, and that's maybe an extreme version of what I mean, but everything, he used a flat ride cymbal, so it and he used like a tighter kind of piccolo snare, at least at certain times in his career, not throughout his career. So he had this kind of very clear, like every single attack on the cymbal was super clear. Every single snare drum hit was very clear. So there's a lot of clear precision, and that's why you get that snap, crackle, pop.
What about Max Roach now?
So Max Roach is, I think he's kind of the consummate bebop drummer because he sort of brought small group drum soloing to the forefront in a way that other drummers hadn't, because he was such you listen to a Max Roach and Clifford Brown record, and he takes an extended drum solo on every track of those records. And that wasn't common. I mean, a lot of times, of course, the drummer was a side player. So it was more, you'd have a drum solo on a few tunes and you'd trade a little bit. But Max Roach he's so featured as a soloist, and I think his soloing was so melodic. There's so much melodicism around the drums, around the toms, how he uses it, and so many things to latch onto as a listener, so many thematic elements that I think he's so essential for drummers, especially especially drummers kind of interested in getting into jazz to listen to, because again, it's kind of a gateway to understanding the bebop soloing vocabulary.
Right.
In terms of his time playing, I think his time playing was kind of the perfect example of that kind of right down the middle sort of triplet swing feel. And it was just, again, it was very clear, but he has kind of a fluff to his playing that Roy Haynes had a kind of a different angle on it, you know?
What about Philly Joe Jones now?
So Philly Joe Jones, we didn't talk too much about this at the beginning, but when you asked what I first started listening to, one of the first things that I got into was Buddy Rich, again, because I was coming in from sort of a big band background, and Tommy was introducing me to a lot of big band playing, and I was essentially studying with him because I wanted to play in my high school big band. So essentially big band, big band, big band. That's the theme here. So Buddy Rich was kind of my go-to at the beginning. And so I was listening for this sort of rudimental language and how to figure that out. And then when I was exposed to Philly Joe Jones in more of a small group setting, I was thinking, wait a minute, this is he's using a very similar language and similar approach to Buddy Rich with all these rudimental things, but it's such a different feeling and it has such a different touch because he's in this smaller group setting. So Philly Joe for me is kind of the highest level of the rudimental bebop drumming. And I think a lot of the other bebop drummers of that same time period were doing similar things and using similar vocabulary, but there was kind of a finesse that he had that the other drummers didn't, and I don't want to say they didn't, it was just different.
Is there a noticeable evolution in the style from like early like Kenny Clarke, Max Roach into like Elvin Jones, Philly Joe Jones, Roy Haynes over that decade? Is there a noticeable shift in the style?
Yes, and I think, but that's also hard to define. I would say that the chronology is not my specialty of that whole thing. Of how, I mean, of course, Kenny Clarke. Yeah, actually, he's an important one that should be mentioned. He's not as much of a household name when it comes to jazz bebop drumming. Yet in the drumming world, of course he is, and he's incredibly essential to understand. And yeah, Kenny Clarke, I think, was also kind of in a similar vein to where Philly Joe Jones took it. I think we're talking about coming from the big band drummers like maybe Papa Joe Jones and doing sort of drum solos that use some rudimental patterns and things like that. And Kenny Clarke was kind of building on that. And I think then Philly Joe Jones, they were all coming out of the big band era, essentially. Let's just face it. And so, but I think there is a clear evolution how they all interpreted it. But the interpretation also comes down to their personalities and their backgrounds, and sometimes the cities that they grew up in. Like Philly Joe Jones is clearly from Philadelphia, so there were different people that he was studying with and different musicians that he was listening to in the clubs in Philadelphia than Roy Haynes, who happened to grow up in the Boston area. So, there's a lot of different elements that come into it. So I don't think there's one clear chronological evolution, yet you can trace how one drummer got some of his ideas. And I think I even still kind of live by that viewpoint now, where, I play plenty of patterns and ideas that come from other drummers, yet I'm trying to incorporate them into my own style, into my own background, into my own, upbringing in jazz and whatever knowledge I possess at this moment.
I want to ask you a question about there's that video of Bill Cosby talking about when he was sitting in with Sonny Stitt playing Cherokee, and he nearly died. Now, what's your advice to staying alive on an up-tempo piece, like something like that?
Yeah, well, so I think the cold hard truth about playing up-tempo is you just got to work on up-tempo as much as you work on medium tempos. But there are, of course, different ways that you can get there, and different exercises that I've gotten from various people, and also just really just being able to kind of gradually push the tempo up of various exercises that you're working on. So when I do a coordination exercise, I try not to just do it at 120 beats per minute. I try to do it at 120, 150, 180, 220, 240, whatever, all sorts of different metronome markings so that I can make sure I have control of it at different speeds, because the technique is going to change a little bit as you get into different tempos. For example, the way you use your fingers to get the bounce of the ride cymbal beat is different for me, at least, is different for me at 150 than it is at 200. So I'm adjusting my technique as I'm getting up to faster tempos. In addition to that technique shift, you're also kind of shifting how the swing beat is actually bouncing, and meaning that in some ways it becomes flatter. The subdivision goes from some closer to more of a dotted eighth and 16th, to then when you get to the medium tempos, more of a triplet. And then when you get to faster tempos, it's more of like an eighth and 2/16, getting ding, dinky, ding, 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 ding. And I try my best to still generate a swing feel at any tempo, but of course there are,
is it true it straightens out as you get much faster?
I do believe that it does, but as I said, I still try to kind of give the essence of swing, and I think you can do that even if, and maybe, we didn't really cover Billy Higgins being one of the really important kind of early bebop drummers, but for just to quickly touch on that, Billy Higgins has a way of kind of making straight eighth notes, or not quite straight eighth notes, kind of swing in a way. And so I've tried to figure that out. And there are other modern drummers who have done that as well. So I think I try, even when I'm playing those really fast tempos and it does flatten out to more of a straight kind of feel, I'm still trying to give the essence of swing. And that's a hard thing to describe just in words. I think you kind of have to sit down with a ride cymbal and kind of go through it. And I will do that with my students. So, but it's more, in this setting, I don't know how much we can really get to the nitty gritty of it, but
there's whole discussions on what is swing. I think there's like a whole Wikipedia article on trying to attempt to define swing, which is pretty interesting. But I know what you mean. Yeah.
There have been some people who have been very successful at for example, Wynton Marsalis is very, very good, and I've seen him lead concerts and performances and master classes where he kind of talks about how the swing feel was created. And it's actually, it's very clear and it makes a lot of sense. But beyond that, then there's so much room for individual interpretation of the swing feel. And for example, if you go to New Orleans, which I actually did about a year ago, you see that there's still variations on it, but you can see that the emphasis is the feeling. It's not necessarily, the emphasis isn't necessarily swinging. It's the feel that you're generating. So it's kind of like when you go to the source of swing, they're still unable to really clearly express it. It's still more about how it feels. And I think that's what all music is really about.
When you're playing like up-tempo swing, I guess I think about this like if I'm playing in 3/2, or playing in 3, do you think of like longer phrases, like since you're playing at a faster tempo, like, so you don't over clutter like a bar of if you're comping, or I guess it depends on the situation, but like, how do you think of like, do you think of like a longer phrase that you're trying to kind of fill up when you're playing up tempo, or shorter, or I don't know?
Yeah, generally that's actually, it's a really good point. I think when you get beyond just the technical aspect of it and being able to kind of maintain that tempo, then I do often think in larger phrases. You think of an 8-bar phrase as kind of one idea, and you can kind of play a comping pattern, whether it's a 3/4 kind of pattern or whatever it is. It can kind of last for that whole 8-bar phrase until you kind of find a resolution point. So I'm definitely thinking in longer phrases, and one way that I actually do exercises for that, to turn that into an exercise, is by doing these, what you do is like a sprint, where I'm sure, people who exercise and go running or jogging do this a lot, where, you sprint as hard as you can for 30 seconds, and then you turn around and you jog back to the spot where you started. And then again, you turn around and you sprint as hard as you can for 30 seconds, and then you jog back to the beginning place. So I do exercises like that when I'm working on up tempo, where I'll play like a medium tempo at 150 or something and just do that for 8 measures. And then I'll kick it into gear and I'll double up the time and play that for 16 measures at that tempo. It's the same exact length of time if you're talking about how many clicks are on the metronome. So it's 8 measures of the regular tempo and then 16 measures of the double time. And you just do that and you kind of go back and forth. And that helps, I think. It helps with thinking of longer phrases because you're thinking of a 16 measure phrase. And then you can also double that up and do 16 measures of the regular tempo, a medium tempo, and then 32 measures of the faster tempo. And that kind of helps you think of a form or a chorus and thinking of it all as one idea, because that's it. Once you finish, then you go back to the medium tempo.
What do you do with left foot? Like, as far as when you're playing up tempo, I noticed that, and this is something I've been trying to be better about. Like, if you're playing slower, people might tend to rock their heel. Heel on 1 and 3, toe on 2 and 4, or just the toe on 2 and 4. But when you're playing up, like, it's you're almost not maybe you specifically, but people often almost tap their heel, almost playing eighth notes or quarter notes rather, versus playing 2 and 4. But they're kind of accenting 2 and 4. What do you do specifically to work on your left foot? Like not dragging or just kind of keeping up with the right hand?
Yeah, well, I do kind of what you're describing. I'm kind of doing it right now, like air drumming with my left foot. And when I'm playing an up tempo, my left foot, and this actually happens at other tempos too, not just up tempo. And it also happens in kind of like a modern setting where I'm playing more even straight music, like straight eighth note music. Where my left foot is going on kind of the quarter notes or the primary pulse of the song, and then I'm kind of popping beats 2 and 4 for the actual open hi-hat for getting that hi-hat sound. I guess one tricky thing is like or again, difficult to talk about in over a phone call versus in a setting where we have a drum set in front of us, is that when I'm opening the hi-hat for 2 and 4 at any tempo, I'm trying to open it and close it as quickly as I possibly can. So it's not actually opening very much. Again, this varies. If I'm playing in the style of Art Blakey, if I'm doing a project that kind of has that sort of Art Blakey-ism, my hi-hat is opening a little bit more than if I'm playing in a different setting or if I'm playing at a faster tempo. But when I'm playing a faster tempo specifically, the hi-hat isn't opening very much at all. It's like a microscopic kind of just like real quick kind of open and close. So I'm doing it where my left foot is definitely bouncing on all 4 quarter notes, but my heel is almost striking the pedal on 2 and 4. It's actually difficult, again, to describe, but also I think it's important to note that I keep my calf muscle engaged at all times. So I'm putting pressure on the front of the pedal with kind of the ball of my foot and my toes, and my heel is kind of what's going up and down. The ball of my foot is actually kind of glued to the pedal. So that's how I get such a micro movement to open it up. And I think if I were just to play 2 and 4 at an up tempo, I think I would feel kind of not grounded. And I really want to feel grounded. And that's why I kind of keep the left foot is kind of going with the right hand in a way in that quarter note pulse.
Do you ever, is that like sort of like almost like a twitch or something? Like you don't swivel your heel at all; it just kind of stays put. I mean, how do you practice that normally? Like, or do you not? Or does it come naturally?
Well, so I did have to practice it, of course, at the beginning, but also I actually in recent years I had some knee problems, and with my left knee specifically, and not anything major, but I did some physical therapy eventually to try to strengthen it and to try to kind of develop it. Basically what happened is I was on a recording session and I had headphones on. And you know how when you have headphones on, you can kind of hear your own voice more clearly and you can feel things in your body more strongly, like maybe, not when you're listening to music, but when you just have headphones on and you're playing and as like a sort of a noise canceling function. I was on this recording session and I was just kind of sound checking the drums. And I noticed I heard this thump, like a really heavy thump on 2 and 4 every time. And I looked down and I was literally like kind of slamming my heel into the hi-hat pedal like as I was tapping my foot, it's almost like you look at the front line of like the Basie big band, and they're all kind of tapping their foot with their heel, and they're kind of and I was kind of doing that, and it was kind of heavy and unnecessarily aggressive, and I realized that that was a source of my knee pain and some of the problems I was experiencing with my knee and other aspects of life, and just like running, for example, was giving me trouble. I was not able to do it. So I basically, after that recording session, I reevaluated how I was playing my left foot, because, you know, you do develop habits after you play for a certain number of years, and then you don't even realize what you're doing until something like that happens, or a problem arises, and then you have to reevaluate it. So at a certain point, I just decided, okay, I'm not going to slam my heel into the ground, because clearly that's not good for my body. And I'm going to strengthen this. So I started to think about it more as gravity, and letting the weight of my leg kind of bring the foot down, instead of forcing it to the ground like stomping. So I was keeping my muscles engaged and thinking of it as pushing downwards rather than stomping into the ground, and thinking of it more as like I'm actually lifting, and then letting gravity bring my foot back down, and then lifting and letting gravity bring my foot back down again. So I think this was just a couple of years ago that I really reevaluated it. So now I have to practice that way, and I have to kind of do some strengthening exercises on a regular basis to keep my left knee strong. But my hi-hat technique has definitely benefited from it, because, you know, when you have something like that, you sort of force yourself to fix it and make it so that you can do what you want to do and have that control. So now it's like these muscles are engaged, and I'm keeping my my knee lifted and my heel lifted, and then, like I said, letting gravity do the rest.
Awesome. Austin, I want to ask you a bit, just briefly, on each person that you've worked with. If you could, again, give a quick kind of takeaway from, you've played with some fantastic people. I just want to hear maybe an anecdote or something from, if I mention a name, do you want to just give me a little brief 3-sentence talk about these people? So if I started with, I mean, you've played with Jerry Braganza. What's that? Can you talk about what's that like, and how you've worked in that ensemble, and how, because
Sure.
I have a question about listening versus just straight comping. How do you balance that, especially when you're working with an artist like Jerry Braganza?
Yeah, well, first of all, I feel really fortunate that I've been able to work with Jerry as much as I have over the years. We had a steady gig for almost 3 years. Every one night a week, every Wednesday, we played at the Acton Jazz Cafe, which no longer exists, unfortunately. But for 3 years straight, that was kind of my jazz school, you know, in a way. And Jerry Braganza he's such an inspiring musician to me, because he has so much enthusiasm and so much curiosity still at this point in his life. You know, he's in his mid 60s, I believe. I'm sorry if I'm wrong, Jerry. And but he has kind of this youthful spirit and this excitement and this curiosity that is lacking in even a lot of younger players. And I don't want to I would never speak badly of anybody, but I just feel that Jerry has something that I aspire to have as I grow as a jazz musician and as I age as a jazz musician, because I've always felt that being a jazz musician is a lifelong commitment. It's not like you're going to, do it until you're 65 and then you retire and you walk away from it all and then you kind of sit at home and do your thing. It's like being a jazz musician is like you do it until you die kind of thing. And Jerry's got this sort of sense about him that makes the music so exciting, because every single solo he plays, every single note he plays, every single tune he's writing is out of, interest and out of desire. He's not just doing it because it's what he has to do. It's like he's always been driven. And so that alone is enough to say, really, because when I show up on the gig, it's just like, you're all there to do it, and you're all invested and committed to making music together, and there's a joy about it too. And I mean, sometimes it's not like the music is all happy and joyful and bouncy. It's like there's plenty of depth and darkness and mystery to it.
Yeah, what does he demand of you as a drummer?
Well, so I think again, I had the fortune of meeting him in a. Actually, I didn't after I first met him, I didn't play with him very much until like 5 years later. So it was really kind of the combination of Phil Grenadier, the trumpet player, who is kind of his mainstay. It's like it's him and Phil. It's almost like Jerry and Phil is kind of the band. It's not just Jerry. I mean, of course, Jerry goes out on the road a lot on his own, and but in town in Boston, it's kind of Phil Grenadier is a totally essential part of that group too, and he has his kind of things that he adds to the music as well. But as far as the demands, it's really, we're all trying to help the music sing and try to make it as clear as, every time Jerry puts a new tune in front of you, it's kind of like, okay, how should I approach this? And he describes it to you. That again is also great, because sometimes Jerry will, rather than saying like, oh, this is a medium swing tune, or it's kind of, that flatter swing feel, he'll just go ding, dit, dit, ding, dit, dit, ding. He'll kind of like, he'll sing a drum groove to you, and he'll even use like the hand motion, and he'll have a smile on his face as he's kind of like air drumming the ride cymbal beat or something. And so, I mean, demand is a strong word for Jerry, because if you're on the gig, you're on the gig because he wants you to be on the gig. And so ideally he wants you to bring what you've got to bring. And at this point, after, like I said, after playing every week for 3 years, we understand each other's as musicians enough and as improvisers that, he kind of is confident that I'll play something in a certain way that will be fitting. And if it doesn't work, we might talk about it, or we might just do it differently the next time.
Give an example of that. I'm curious about that. So how long did it take for you to really feel like you fit in like a glove? And describe a situation where something doesn't work and how he would probably talk to you as a leader talking to a drummer, and how he would rectify that.
Well, so, it's interesting because we did a couple of meetings where we would get together and just play through some tunes, sort of like, I don't want to call it a rehearsal, but it was essentially as close to a rehearsal as I ever had with Jerry. So most of what we've done together has been just live in front of an audience, and we have done a couple of recordings together. And so I've had the experience of being in the studio with him. Again, it's kind of, though he was a co-leader on one of the recordings, and we were both sidemen on another one of the recordings that we did. So he didn't have a lot of specific direction. I remember one gig early on where I was not yet feeling comfortable in the group and kind of feeling unsure of myself as a drummer and unsure of how to approach the band. And I remember we tried this one tune, and it was kind of a different feel. It wasn't just kind of a swing tune. And it ended up kind of pushing a little bit, the way the drummer or the bass player and I were playing the tune kind of pushed. And after the tune, he kind of just looked over at me and he was like, yeah, that was pretty good. I mean, we pushed the tempo a little bit, but yeah. And that was about all I got. So he didn't have any specific concrete thing to say. And I was fully aware that we were rushing, but he was just kind of, but after that, it was almost like the few words that he said were enough to get me really focused on thinking about what was important, because clearly the time feel was an important thing to him, if that's what he commented on that tune. And so, I think from that point on, I started to kind of just, I think my time feel actually evolved a little bit during that first year, probably, that I was playing with Jerry. And also it was definitely influenced by the bass player, Bruce Gertz, and his time feel and how we connected. And I think it took a little while for Bruce and I to kind of decide on where we were both going to put the beat and how that was going to work together. I mean, don't get me wrong. It worked from the beginning. It was just one of those things that when you have the opportunity to play weekly with a band or with other musicians, I think you start to kind of refine how it goes. And I'm the type of musician that I want to continue to evolve, and I don't want to just play exactly like I played 10 years ago or even 1 year ago. I want to I want to interact with musicians in different ways and develop new ways to think about that stuff. So this was kind of a process of Bruce and I kind of deciding how the time feel was going to settle. And of course, different tempos and different meters and different tunes are always going to have an influence on that. And it's just something that it began to feel good. I mean, it always felt good, don't get me wrong again, but I would go and play with other musicians who I didn't play with as regularly, and they would say, "Oh, your time feels a little more assertive than it was last time we played," you know? And so there were definitely effects of what was happening in the band and how I was thinking about the priorities of that group.
Now we're running out of time, Austin. I want to ask you about Fractamodi, and can you talk about the 3 albums that you released as a leader, and talk about the future projects with Fractamodi as well?
Yeah, so Fractamodi is something that I started with 2 very close friends around the time that I was trying to basically put out music of my own as a leader. And it was also largely inspired by wanting to help friends of mine, Carmen Stoff in particular, who was also recording music and had been writing a lot of really fantastic music that, and she basically was kind of like, well, should I shop around for a record label or what should I do? And I said, well, I think this was kind of the beginning of sort of the independent, do-it-yourself kind of music moment. And I think I basically just kind of jumped on the train. I didn't, it's not like a strongly founded record label. I started, as I said, I started it with 2 friends of mine. And after a little while, they got busy with other things in their lives. Actually, one of them is a lawyer and one of them is an author. And, but they were both musically inclined and very interested in kind of having a record label and being in sort of a producer kind of role. And so I think we had bigger hopes for what Fractamodi was going to be when I was first trying to establish it. And but it basically just kind of became a home base for me and my friends, or close musical collaborators. I shouldn't just say friends, because it wasn't just open to anybody who wanted to make a record. To kind of collaborate and work on the process of getting an album mixed and mastered, and and getting the artwork done and then putting it out. But after I released my couple of albums, I didn't really do much to promote it, and in some ways I regret that, but it's still there, and I still have hopes that I will kind of revive it, and I'm still glad that there's kind of a home base for my music.
You have to, man. I'm telling you.
Right. It's just like
Chris and I will be on your case if you don't.
Well, I have some ideas, and I'm hoping to do a little bit more as a leader in coming years. I have some ideas, and I'm hoping to, again, release another album. It's been since 2011 that I released an album as a leader, and I've done a few gigs that I've been the band leader, but and played my compositions. But in recent years, I've been doing more as kind of like a co-leader, where I play in a few different bands where we play my compositions in those bands. It's not, but I'm not the leader of the band. I'm not the front man.
Can you talk about some recent compositions you've done?
Sure. I just this past summer was a big summer for me doing different recording projects as a sideman. And as I said, with 3 different groups, I actually recorded some of my compositions. And probably the most recent composition I've written was inspired by this book by Albert Camus, which is called The Stranger, or L'étranger in French. But it's basically the book is kind of like a downward spiral. It's kind of like the book is kind of at the beginning of the existentialism kind of period of writing and philosophy. And so basically this kind of happy-go-lucky guy sort of runs into these various events that kind of lead him on a downward spiral, and it goes pretty much as downward as it can go. And so I started writing a tune. I read the book in actually just 2 or 3 days over the summer, and then A friend of mine, Bruno Rayberg, a great friend and bass player and composer who I have immense respect for and I love working with, he said, we have this recording session coming up soon. Would you like to contribute a tune? And I was like, oh yeah, I would absolutely love to. And the book just really was speaking to me almost in musical terms. So I was writing it all by ear, just kind of in my head. And so I had this bass line. And then the harmony, I wanted it to be kind of dark and mysterious, just like the book, where it's sort of supposed to feel, you get the sense that this guy, things are good in his life. And so it starts out where we kind of have this sort of pleasant kind of sound, but quickly into the tune, you kind of realize what you realize in the story, which is that things are not going so well. And and it's getting dark. And so I kind of wrote the tune basically kind of on the same path as the book. And not a lot of my compositions have been that programmatic in terms of taking a story and turning it into sound, but I definitely feel like my writing is emotionally driven and is coming from some sort of source of feeling, and not just kind of like, okay, here I'm going to sit down at the piano and play a few notes and see where it goes. That's so, my compositional process is first internal, and then I try to get it onto the page or get it onto the piano.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and you've really given us some wonderful information. I really hope you'll come back to the show again.
Yeah.
And please, you have to get on with that original music again with your Fractamodi, because I think it'll be fantastic. And we're going to put the links to those albums too. We want people to check that out, as well as your recent your Sidemen projects as well. And just thank you so much for coming on the show, and we hope you'll come back again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to talk with you both.
And we'll hopefully see you around too. Maybe we'll have you back at the school to do a clinic again too.
Yeah, I would love that. That would be great.
All right, Austin, thank you for coming on the show.
All right, thank you, Nikhil. Take care. Best of luck.
Thank you so much for listening to my interview with the fantastic Austin McMahon. A great privilege to be able to talk to such an accomplished musician. If you like the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes so we can continue to get more great guests. Thank you so much, and hope to see you at the next show.